So the Irish government have come out and said through Micheál Martin that the COVID inquiry into Ireland and into the government's response to the pandemic is being finalised, which means that the government that was involved in making the decisions that are going to be investigated and inquired into are now making the decision on maybe not so much the selection in total of the people who be involved in the inquiry, but also they will be responsible for and in control of determining the terms of reference of the inquiry. And what the terms of reference involve, or what they mean, is which areas of the pandemic response will be investigated and through which sort of scope, right? So are we looking for total criminality, or are we looking for the information and the facts of the pandemic response so that we can sort of come up with better solutions for the future, right? So they're two very different things, and the current government are in control of how this inquiry goes and to, as I said, which areas they're allowed inquire into and gather the facts of, right? And number one, that's a nonsense, okay? So it's like asking someone who robs a bank to come up with an impartial way of investigating how that bank was robbed, right? And the bank robber gets to decide which detectives are on it and which areas the detectives are allowed to investigate. Like, it's a nonsense, okay? So, but it's going ahead anyway, right? And what's interesting about this is, at least in terms of a psychological point of view, is that this isn't something that is not of interest or should not be of interest to the common person, because every single one of us were involved in the response this government took to the COVID pandemic. So it not only were we involved in it, it totally upended and disrupted nearly all of our lives in some way. Some people, their work was derailed, their businesses were derailed. Some people's ability to retain friendships or relationships with their family was derailed, right? And we've all known stories, like we all know the people and the stories that they weren't allowed to Christmas until they got vaccinated, right? That sort of stuff. Or people wouldn't come into someone's house unless they were all that kind of stuff, right? So it impacted on all of our lives in some way. People weren't allowed to walk beyond 5 kilometres from their house, right? The government was allowed to decide how many people you were allowed to have in your house and from which areas those people should be coming from in order to be allowed inside in your house. They also granted themselves the power to be able to enter your house if they felt like you were breaking the order, right? If you felt like you were breaking the COVID restrictions, right? So we were all involved in this in some way. And now you get to the point of a coercion, right? And being forced to take the vaccine. And it's an easy kind of line to trot out saying, look, the government forced people to take the vaccine. That's not necessarily true, right? Force means you were moved into a physical position against your will and had something physically done to you against your will. So, like, being technical about it, you can't use the word forced because it doesn't really apply. You were certainly coerced. The media all ran the same line of safe and effective. If you don't get it, you're being selfish. You're putting other people's lives at risk. Poor granny might drop dead in your presence if you don't get it, right? So that was trot out by these orgs, so the WHO, the World Health Organization, right? You had your man, I forget his name, something Ryan, I think, but he's an Irish guy. He was part of the WHO, and he was speaking of entering people's homes and separating families, separating children from their parents based on COVID restrictions and not adhering to the vaccine rollout and stuff, right? So this stuff, the psychological manipulation was very, very present, okay? And everyone felt it because you had people who weren't really sure about it, but they may have went and got it because they wanted to go on holidays. So there was an understanding in their minds that I'm being stopped from doing something I want to do because I haven't got this thing that I'm told I should get first. So in order for me to get permission to leave the country and enjoy a holiday, I know that I will have to go along with what the government, the media, the medical industry, and almost any other societal pillar, at least as we understand it today, what they're advocating for. Okay? So people wanted to go on holidays, they wanted to go back to work, they didn't want to be refused from restaurants and stuff. They wanted to be able to go and carry out their life the way it was prior to this pandemic. So there was an understanding in people's minds, however fully aware of it they were, or fully conscious or self-reflective they were about it, that they were being stopped doing something that they wanted to do until they'd done what they were told, essentially, or what was recommended to them, right? So people made choices. They made choices to make their lives a little bit more normal to them, or a little bit more easy, or more relaxed, a little bit more convenient for them. So they went and took something that was said to be safe and effective, which is proven not to be the case. Okay? So they bought a lie. They then went and took an action themselves to get injected with something that is totally experimental. And is so experimental that each country had to agree with the emergency use of a medical treatment, right? Because it hadn't been run through the proper gamut of testing. And the testing that it did go through, we found in the Pfizer papers, that Pfizer wanted sealed for 75 years. We find that the animals who this thing was tested on either became infertile or died. Okay, so these things were all in the ether nearly at the time. We got to see this play out moment by moment. And the people that were investigating the validity of this thing and the legitimacy of all of this stuff in real time, absolutely more power to them. Like, they probably saved a lot of lives. They have done an immense good for mankind, and they will be remembered historically if they're ridiculed in the present, right? They'll be remembered historically as good people and trying to do the right thing. But back to those who made the choice. What those choices say about each individual, whether they made them or not, was that there was a price that they put on their freedom. There was a price that they put on their bodily integrity and their moral integrity, and even their philosophical integrity. There was a choice and a price on their decision-making ability, and whether they were going to go it alone and stick to their values, or whether they were going to buckle and fold and take the suggested thing. There was a price on that. Now, how many of those people have put their hand up and said, do you know what? I agree with that. There was a price to pay, and I just wanted to be able to do this, therefore I gave up my bodily integrity. I sacrificed that for the sake of a holiday. How many people are going to admit that? Because they kind of said it tongue-in-cheek, going, look, can't get out of the country till I get it, so might as well. Ha ha ha. How real is that? Or is the holiday an excuse for conformity? Do you know what I mean? Because if you were genuinely, unashamedly going and giving that up for a holiday, you'd be okay with saying, yeah, I sacrificed my bodily integrity for the sake of getting permission to go on a holiday. You would stick to that, right? But how many people are actually going to be interested in having that exposed? Because that's what a legitimate inquiry would show, is that this thing wasn't a legitimate vaccine. We even had to change the definition of a vaccine in order to pigeonhole this thing under the umbrella of vaccine, right? The safety data material and information, they tried to postpone the release of that for 75 years, which would allow for anyone involved in that to be probably long dead by the time it's exposed and released. That tells you enough in and of itself. Right, so a legitimate inquiry would gather all of these things, and people watching that and paying attention to it will be forced to reflect on the choices and the decisions that they made along the way, regardless of what they were, right? So you have it's looking like, I seen a post there that on average it was about 15% of people who refused to take it. That's a small number. But what those people decided on was that there is nothing in this world that could force me or coerce me enough, because we sidelined the force thing, because I think force would have eventually been introduced to a greater degree than it was used. But the pandemic thing fell apart anyway, right? But those who decided that there's no way that you can manipulate and coerce me into giving up my bodily integrity, those people have no shame, right? Because the decision that they made turns out to be a very wise one, even if it was made intuitively or instinctually, if it wasn't made based on information, available information, which we didn't really have much of at the time, or at least we weren't privy to. Right, so there's no shame in the people that stood their ground with that. In fact, there's great honour to be bestowed on those people, because they showed that absolutely you can stand up in the face of near nationwide and global opposition when you're just a part of a 15%. And none of us knew, no one in that 15% knew how great or small the number of other like-minded people was, right? So nobody was really aware of that. We're still not really aware of that. Can you trust the numbers? Was it 85% of people that took it? Were they all legitimate, and did all of these needles hold the same chemicals in them? Were there saline solutions? We don't know. And a legitimate inquiry would be looking into that sort of stuff, right? Why were we stuffing patients who left the hospital with COVID into nursing homes? Why were we doing that? Why did Simon Harris do that in Ireland? Is it Andrew Cuomo, the New York governor at the time? I think that's his title. But why did he do the same thing? Who decided that? Why did they come up with the exact same, nearly counterintuitive way of managing that? So there's crazy conflicting things going on here, and I'm fundamentally, like, all that stuff will be ironed out eventually. But the interesting part to me is the choices that people made. And I mentioned there a few minutes ago that those who stood their ground and didn't betray their values or their virtues or principles, they don't really have anything to hide. In fact, they've nearly everything to gain by an inquiry. But it's those who gave up their bodily integrity, who sacrificed their ability to make a free choice, or to express themselves freely and live freely. They made a choice to forsake that for the sake of government permission to do something, whatever it was, right? Get back to work, or get into a restaurant, or leave the country, or whatever it was, right? So people gave up that. And a legitimate inquiry would be highlighting that stuff. And then it's left on all of our plates to reckon with the decisions that we made. So we're being confronted by our past. The person we were 3-4 years ago, probably under overwhelming, in some cases, pressure to conform, and the fear of a potential death being at your door, or a guard or a soldier being at your door, right? That sort of stuff. This is where we were. And we're being confronted with that. What did you do when the chips were stacked against you? Did you buckle and give up and sacrifice your own integrity for government permission to do something, which equals conformity? Because that's what it was, right? There was no rational, solid, scientific grounds for the decisions that were made. You should not have been in the position to have to make those decisions. But that's a separate argument, right? The decision was made by yourself. We all made one. So when the day comes when you're confronted with the past and yourself, the old you, how fondly do you look at that person? Have you grown in any way from that person? Or can you look back and say, you know what, I would make the exact same decision today? Can you do that? So these are fascinating times, and a real pivotal time, I think, in man's history. Because whether you like it or not, you can bury your head in the sand all you want, But if you're interested in growing and developing and maturing and learning from the past and becoming a little bit wiser as the years roll on, then the topic of confronting your past decisions should be a very enticing and interesting one to you, because it's a challenge. You're going to meet the you of 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, who was forced in the face of evil, something that was trying to make you do something, and was wielding great threats against you to do something. And how did you react to that? That's the person you're going to meet again today, going forward, as these inquiries roll on, if you haven't been facing that every day since you made those decisions. So are you going to be happy with the person you meet when it's given back to you, and the decisions you made based on what? Based on being scared or losing something? So fascinating times. And the question around that is, how many people, coming from what I'm just after saying there, or building on what I'm just after saying there, how many people are going to be genuinely interested in the truth coming out of this? Because if the truth comes out that these things weren't safe and effective, your government lied to you, the media lied to you, doctors, scientists, all that stuff lied to you, if that all comes out and is shown to you to be 100% the truth, as close as you can get to it anyway, right? Then you bought a lie. And you have to admit that to yourself, or deny it to yourself, but you have to wrestle with that fact. So how many people are genuinely interested in this thing going ahead, and the scales of justice being perfectly blind and balanced? How many people are going to be interested in that? It's interesting times.